Well, let me turn to the second major story in today's paper, the lead story by Bernard Gwertzman on a senatorial resolution to bar arms for Jordan until Jordan joins what the government and the press refer to as the peace process. The background for this in the last week is the trip of King Hussein to Washington and his proposals as to how to bring negotiations forward. Now again, the way the government and the New York Times, essentially the same thing, the way they describe this is extremely revealing. Here it's in part a matter of suppression of crucial fact, but in part it's also a matter of framing issues in such a way that the crucial questions are all prejudged, so that if you enter into their framework of discussion, the discussion is already over. Let's take the same journalist, Bernard Gwertzman, who's the Times diplomatic correspondent who's been dealing with this, and consider the way he has been reporting it. So, for example, 2 days ago on Sunday's paper, he had an article reviewing the King Hussein's visit and describing what it had accomplished and what the problems were. The headline of the article said something like this. It said, it was a question. It said, are the Palestinians ready to seek peace? Well, that headline is interesting. As soon as we see the headline, again, a rational person will know that they're entering into a web of deceit. Because the fact is, it's obvious that the Palestinians seek peace. In fact, no matter what you think of them, they seek peace. Hitler sought peace. Genghis Khan sought peace. Everyone seeks peace. The point is, everyone seeks peace on certain terms. The question is, what terms, what are those terms? So an honest headline would have said, are the Palestinians ready to seek peace on American terms? That would be an honest headline that you could ask. But notice how the Times reports it. They say, are the Palestinians ready to seek peace? What they're doing is defining peace as peace on American terms. Now, there could not be a more clear expression of the self-image of the New York Times as an organ of state propaganda, self-image in this case, namely the definition of the term peace as meaning peace on American terms. There's also a subheading to the article which goes something like this. It says, United States is encouraged despite the familiar obstacles. What are the familiar obstacles? Well, plainly, the familiar obstacles do not include the American rejection of meaningful peace negotiations. No, because the United States is encouraged. And if we read the article, we find that no United States policy is an obstacle. The obstacles are the policies of our adversaries, of the Arab states, of the PLO, and so on. Again, this is a newspaper, so-called, not a government propaganda, not what is supposed to be a government propaganda statement. But the way the issue is formulated, the question's already finished. Nobody can be opposed to peace. Peace has been defined as what the United States government wants. Therefore, everyone must be in favor of what the United States government wants. No further question arises. The obstacles are only the obstacles raised by those who stand in the way of the American government. Now, if we step back a little bit and look at the historical background, what's going on here becomes very clear and quite striking. In fact, there are two, the simplest fact about the Arab-Israeli conflict is that there are two national groups which claim the right of national self-determination in the same territory, in what used to be Palestine. One of those national groups is the indigenous population, the Palestinians. The other of those national groups is are the settlers who immigrated and displaced, and to some extent expelled them. That's the second national group. Both of those groups claim national self-determination. Now, let's put aside complex issues, and let's assume without any further question that the Jewish settlers who immigrated have the right of national self-determination there. Clearly, the indigenous population has at least the same right of national self-determination. Therefore, we are, on those assumptions, we're left with two national groups claiming a right of national self-determination. Correspondingly, there are two forms of what we ought to call rejectionism. There is the stance of those who reject the right of Jews to have national self-determination in the state of Israel, and there is the stance of those who deny the right or reject the right of the indigenous population, the Palestinians, to have national self-determination in a state in the former Palestine. The first, we use the term rejectionist in the New York Times and elsewhere only for the first group. those who deny the right of the Palestinians to national self-determination are not called rejectionists. Now, what would a non-rejectionist position be? What would a position be that tries to accommodate these two conflicting rights? Well, it would be a position which says that a settlement in the Middle East must include, that its basic principles would include recognition of the right of the Palestinians to national self-determination in an independent state, number one. Number two, it would include the right of every state in the region, Israel included specifically, to sovereignty and security within recognized borders. These should be the basic principles. That would be a non-rejectionist settlement. Next question, who advocates the non-rejectionist settlement and who opposes it? Well, that's easily answered, though you'll learn virtually nothing about this from the New York Times, now or ever. The ones who support this position with essentially this position, are first of all, most of Europe, secondly, the non-aligned countries, thirdly, the Soviet Union. In fact, what I just stated was a very close paraphrase of a proposal by Leonid Brezhnev in, I think, February 1981, proposing a settlement of the Arab-Israeli conflict. That was not reported in the New York Times, nor did the New York Times report the fact that that proposal for a non-rejectionist settlement explicitly mentioning Israel and the sovereignty of Israel was unanimously supported by the Palestinian National Council. That was also not reported. So the Soviet Union supports it, the non-aligned countries support it, Europe supports it, the major Arab states have supported that settlement for years. The PLO has supported it explicitly for a long period. In January 1976, the PLO, in fact, prepared a proposal for the United Nations, which was put forth by Syria, Jordan, and Egypt, calling for a two-state settlement, Israel and a new Palestinian state with recognition of the rights of each, territorial guarantees and so on. That was vetoed by the United States. The PLO supported the statement by President Carter and Brezhnev in October 1977, calling for normal, peaceful relations between Israel and its neighbors, and merely not even referring to a Palestinian state, just talking about Palestinian rights. PLO supported that. That was immediately withdrawn under extreme Israeli pressure. The PLO unanimously supported the Brezhnev proposal that I've just mentioned. Last year, just to mention another case, in April and May 1984, Yasser Arafat in Europe and in Asia called repeatedly for negotiations with Israel leading to mutual recognition. The New York Times refused to publish that. It was widely published in Europe. The New York Times even refused to publish letters referring to that. That can't be in history, remember. That's down the memory hole. These are a few of the many cases. So we now have, that's who supports this non-rejectionist settlement. Who opposes it? Well, the primary powers that oppose it are the United States and Israel, which of course opposes it. Israel's position is that it will not negotiate with the representatives of Palestinian nationalism, namely the PLO. That position was recently stated explicitly by the Israeli ambassador to the United Nations, Benjamin Netanyahu, who said Israel will not negotiate with the PLO, period. This has always been the position of the Israeli government, including the Labor government. Abba Eban, the Labor dove, stated back in 1969 that the Palestinians have no role to play, those were his words, in a political settlement. Just quickly bringing it to the present, the current Israeli government, the Paris government, ran in the 1984 elections on a platform of 4 no's. No withdrawal to the 1967 borders, no removal of settlements from the occupied territories, no Palestinian state, no negotiations with the PLO. That's their position. That's a position which is called healthy pragmatism in the New York Times editorial, no on every substantive issue. That's rejectionism. Incidentally, to fill the story, along with the United States and Israel, the rejection front also includes Libya and the minority rejection front of the PLO. They are the opposite kinds of rejectionism. Well, let's come back to Bernard Gortzman's story. Are the Palestinians ready to seek peace? Well, the question, what the Times is really saying is this: are the Palestinians ready to accept a rejectionist peace in which they do not participate? Notice that the United States insists upon the right and the New York Times supports them in this and regards it as legitimate, the United States insists upon the right to select those Palestinians who can take part in negotiations, and they cannot include the PLO. PLO has the same sort of, whatever you think about the PLO, anything you like, the PLO has the same sort of legitimacy that the Zionist organization had in 1947. If someone in 1947 had proposed that Jews would be allowed to take part in negotiations concerning the outcome of the conflict in the Middle East, but no Zionists would be permitted, such a person would be regarded as an extreme racist and anti-Semite. And exactly the same conclusion holds for the American rejectionism, which is endorsed by the United States today. Well, that's the background. Now let's proceed with Gortzman's article. He goes on to say that hope is being raised in Washington that perhaps the PLO will finally agree to take part in a negotiated settlement. The actual fact of the matter is that the PLO has long been willing to take part in a negotiated settlement and has repeatedly offered that, though the news was suppressed and censored out by the New York Times, and that it's Israel that refuses to take part in a negotiated settlement. As mentioned, the Israeli policy is 4 no's, including no negotiations with the PLO, with the representatives of the Palestinians, and there is no question that they are the representatives of the Palestinians in the occupied territories and elsewhere. Then Gortzman goes on to say that there's hope being raised in Washington, though Israel is skeptical, that perhaps Jordan will come forth with a proposal. Well, again, that's nonsense. Jordan proposed a political settlement in 1971. That was a settlement which didn't even mention the Palestinians, just called for a settlement on the pre-June 67 borders with no Palestinian rights. Israel didn't even respond. In 1972, Jordan proposed a confederation of the West Bank and Jordan as a step towards a settlement. Israel's response to that was to declare, that was the Labor government, that the historic right of Israel to all of Palestine, that is up to the Jordan, is beyond question, and to increase settlement. Since 1975, Jordan has been part of the international consensus calling for a 2-state settlement, and as I mentioned, even put forth in the United Nations the PLO prepared proposal for a 2-state settlement in January 1976. And in fact, repeatedly, they have been saying that they are willing to make an exchange of land for peace. That means total peace for total land is their formula. That is precisely the international consensus, I should say, blocked by the United States. So that statement was nonsense. Then Gortzman goes on to describe the obstacles. For example, one obstacle is the insistence that the Soviet Union be part of a settlement, which of course the United States, of a conference, which the United States and Israel will not accept. Well, one can have various attitudes towards that, but let's recognize what's involved. What the Times is saying is that it's an obstacle, it would be an unacceptable, and this is an obstacle for negotiations, it would be unacceptable to bring in a power which has called explicitly for a non-rejectionist 2-state settlement in which the rights of Israel would be recognized, its right of sovereignty and its right for security within recognized borders. That is intolerable. The only outside power that's allowed to be part of these negotiations, and this is taken for granted, is a rejectionist power, the United States, which refuses to allow the representatives of Palestinian nationalism to participate, which not only insists at a rhetorical level, but gives massive support to Israel to advance its rejectionist programs of slow integration of the occupied territories, which has backed the Israeli attack against Lebanon and so on. That's the only power that's allowed to enter, but not one that calls for a 2-state settlement in accord with the international consensus. Well, if this was an editorial position of the New York Times, one could say, fine, they can take whatever editorial position they want, but it's not. This is a news analysis. This is a news analysis which presupposes the principles of government policy. It presupposes that what the government says is true. That's not debatable. The stand taken by the United States government is unquestionable. Peace is perfectly Orwellian. Peace equals rejectionism. Moderation equals fanaticism. That's what we start with. Those issues are undiscussable. Then we can go on from there. This, incidentally, is quite consistent. So, for example, a little earlier, Thomas Friedman, the New York Times correspondent in Israel, I think this was March 17th, had a about then, had an article, a long article in the Times, reviewing the history of peace negotiations. That's very interesting to look at. The proposals that I mentioned weren't there. There was no January 1976 proposal at the United Nations for a two-state settlement vetoed by the United States. There was no Arafat offer of April, May 1984 for negotiations and mutual recognition. There was no proposal by Sadat in February 1971 for a settlement which didn't even offer any rights to the Palestinians, and a comparable offer by Jordan. None of that stuff is there. What is there are the American offers. Coming back to Gortzman 2 days ago, one of the statements he makes is that Hussein's trip to Washington was the first time that the Arabs had made a credible offer for peace since 1977, since Sadat. Implication, the prior offers were not credible, and the offers since were not credible. That is, it's not credible when the PLO offers negotiations and mutual recognition. That's not a credible offer for peace. It's not credible when, last February, Jordan and the Palestinians say return of territories for total peace. It's not credible when Sadat offered a peace without even any recognition of the Palestinians back in 1971. Well, again, that makes sense if we understand credible offer to mean offer which is in accordance with U.S. government policy. Again, that's the way the propaganda system works. Thomas Friedman, in the article that I mentioned, not only has a wonderfully Orwellian selection of what counts as a peace proposal, namely excluding all of those which are inconsistent with American government aims, crucial ones, but also he rather neatly misrepresents some of the central UN resolutions. So, for example, he says that United Nations Resolution 242, Security Council Resolution 242, recognizes the rights of all nations in the region to self-determination. That's false, and in fact, crucially false, unless we conclude, along with the U.S. government, that the Palestinians are not a nation, because UN 242 says nothing about Palestinian national rights. In fact, that's been the sticking point for years. This resolution refers to the Palestinians solely as refugees. Its only reference to the Palestinians is in a statement which says that that the problem of the refugees should be settled in a decent fashion, should be settled properly, that's all. So that's a crucial distortion. Same with Bernard Gortzman, incidentally, who in the report I just mentioned states that it has become axiomatic in the Middle East that a political settlement must be based centrally on Resolution 242. That's false. It's axiomatic in Washington, but it's certainly not axiomatic in the Middle East for the very simple reason that UN 242 is a rejectionist resolution, which does not have any reference to the right of national self-determination of the indigenous population. Well, yeah.
You're making it sound as though the United States is against peace in the Middle East. I mean, what are
the United States isn't against peace. Let me say again, nobody is ever against peace. Hitler was for peace, the Palestinians are for peace, the United States is for peace, Israel's for peace. The question is, what peace? Well, there is one form of a peace settlement that the United States does oppose, namely a non-rejectionist one. The United States will accept peace if it is in accord with what the New York Times calls the healthy pragmatism of the labor government. If a peace settlement allows Israel to incorporate those parts of the occupied territories that it wants to hold on to, if a peace settlement rejects the right of national self-determination for the Palestinians under the leadership of their chosen leaders, the PLO, meaning any meaningful self-determination, then the United States will accept it. That's a rejectionist settlement. It's comparable to the position of Libya with regard to Israel. In fact, if we were honest, we would simply say that the United States heads the rejectionist camp and has been doing so for 15 years.
So what's in it for the United States? I mean,
Well,
why spend these billions
global
war?
Oh, that's a complicated story, but back about, if you look at it has to do with the relations between the United States and Israel. The United States has tried to, there's been debate about this among American planners, but the position that's won out consistently has been a position that holds that Israel is what they call a strategic asset, that a powerful Israel, which is militarily advanced and technologically competent and completely dependent on the United States, hence a pariah state lacking an independent economy, that such a state would be very valuable for the United States. It would be an attack dog that we can use to defend American interests in the region. It could be what used to be called a guardian of the Gulf. This position, which was developing for many years, received its kind of current formulation within the framework of the Nixon Doctrine around 1970. The idea was that the United States did not have the power to police the entire world. We didn't have that kind of power anymore. We needed surrogate states, client states, local cops on the beat following orders from Washington that would control particular regions. And Israel and then Iran under the Shah were to be the basis for the projection of American force, the guardians, the gendarmes in the Middle East region. Israel was felt to be, was regarded as playing that role. Now notice the conception of Israel, there's more to it than that, naturally. Israel is also expected to play secondary roles. So to come back to Central America, when Congress imposed certain limitations on the state executive in regard to Central American dictatorships, say, take Guatemala in the late 1970s. In the late 1970s, there was an attempt in Guatemala, again, to steal our resources. That is, the Indians who forever had been living lives of misery and oppression began to organize, and a guerrilla movement developed aimed against the regime that we had established there in 1954 and have kept there since. And I should say that of the countries of the modern world, that's probably the one that comes closest to resembling Nazi Germany, and we've kept it that way with repeated introduction of American aid, even American military forces. Again, this began to collapse in the late 70s. The Guatemalan army once again began to carry out brutal, murderous actions, which even the conservative Guatemalan church described as genocide. The United States was unable to participate in these genocidal acts to the extent that it wished because of congressional human rights limitations, and therefore it had to turn to surrogate states, including first Argentine neo-Nazis, but also crucially Israel, which moved in, sent advisors, sent arms. You identify a government soldier by the Galil rifle that he holds. And under the Rios Montt government claims, probably correctly, that it came to power through the help of its Israeli advisors, and it immediately launched a very successful, I should say, genocidal operation in several regions, which crushed, crushed the attempt of the native population to try to overcome the structure of starvation, slavery, and torture that we've imposed on them. Now, the United States could not participate directly in that. Israel was able to. The same was true in Nicaragua. At the end of Somoza's rule, the United States government was blocked, the Carter government was blocked by congressional legislation from direct participation at a time when Somoza's National Guard was killing about 50,000 people, laying the country waste. So the Carter administration was able to essentially support Somoza through its Israeli subsidiary. This has also been true in Africa. That's the way in which the United States has been able to support the dictatorships of the Southern Cone and Latin America and so on. In other words, a highly militarized, technologically advanced state which is dependent on the United States, which is in a system of military confrontation, therefore must be dependent on the United States for its survival. That has certain advantages to a state that's committed to maintaining control of much of the world by force and violence, both the region itself and elsewhere. I think that essentially lies at the background of American rejectionism. This, too, is taboo. You will not find this discussed certainly here or in the United States. So we have, let me go back a step further. Last October, Thomas Friedman, again, the New York Times correspondent in Jerusalem, had a long magazine article. It was called, I think, The Power of the Fanatics. And the idea was that there are certain, in the Middle East is being taken over by fanatics. There are moderates left, but not many, and they're going to be overcome by fanaticism. Well, who are the fanatics? Turns out if you look, that the fanatics are, for example, the PLO, which is calling for a two-state political settlement, recognizing the right of self-determination of both national groups. The moderates are the United States, which is completely rejectionist, and which denies the right of self-determination on the part of the indigenous population. Friedman says that he says that a majority of people in Israel still support a trade of territory for peace, still support a moderate position. Let me recall again the last elections, 1984, when the moderate party, the Labour Party, ran on the program of 4 no's. No return to the 1967 borders, no removal of settlements, no negotiations with the PLO, and no Palestinian state. That's what Friedman is calling moderate. The Times is healthy pragmatism. So here we have, I talked before about how rejectionism means peace. Here we have fanaticism becoming moderation. The true fanatics in the region, again by rational standards, by non-racist standards in this case, by standards that accord to the native population the same rights that we accord to the Jews in the state of Israel. By those standards, the fanatics are the United States, primarily, in the New York Times, and the state of Israel, and the moderates include those we call fanatics. So here we have a real Orwellian achievement. The question is framed in such a way that all the issues are prejudged. We begin by defining peace as what the American government wants. We begin by defining an obstacle to peace as anything that stands in the way of American rejectionism. Unwanted facts are eliminated from the record. If Arafat offers negotiations leading to mutual recognition, that's not a fact because it doesn't accord with the desired picture. Some of the earlier facts were reported in the Times, incidentally. If you go back to January 1976, you'll discover that the New York Times did report that Jordan, Egypt, and Syria proposed to the United Nations a 2-state settlement recognizing the national rights of both Israeli Jews and Palestinian Arabs with territorial guarantees and security and so on. They reported that was violently opposed by Israel and vetoed by the United States. They did not report the statement by the Israeli UN ambassador, now the Israeli president, Chaim Herzog, his statement that that proposal was prepared by the PLO, though they did report that the PLO supported that proposal. However, these facts are also down the memory hole. When Thomas Friedman gives a review of peace proposals in the Middle East, they're not there. It's very much like the bombing of South Vietnam in 1962. It happened. You can find it if you go back to the original New York Times articles, but it's inconsistent with the image of the United States that the Times is committed to create. Therefore, the facts are gone. They're out of history. You have to be an avid historian, who really goes back to do archival work to even know that they took place. That's the way an effective propaganda system works. It doesn't necessarily have to, it suppresses some of the facts, it allows others in, but it recreates and reshapes history so as to meet the current needs of the state propaganda system, in part by the simple Orwellian device of redefining peace as meaning American government aims for peace, in part by simply suppressing facts that are unwanted by a process of selection, omission, shaping, and distortion. And the result is a system of indoctrination that's quite extraordinarily effective.